Tonight, we begin with a development that Western intelligence officials had feared, Eastern European allies had monitored, and Kremlin watchers had desperately tried to predict. A leak that unfolded not over months of careful investigation, but in 72 hours of chaos. 72 hours that exposed fractures at the highest levels of Russian military command. 72 hours that revealed what generals say when they believe no one is listening. 72 hours that may have fundamentally altered the course of this conflict. What emerged from inside the Kremlin this week crossed a line that Moscow had hoped would never break. And when that line broke, Western intelligence agencies did not hesitate. They responded with precision, coordination, and an urgency that signals something far more significant is happening behind closed doors in Moscow than anyone publicly admits. The intercepted communications we're about to discuss are not propaganda. They are not speculation. They are, according to multiple sources within NATO intelligence circles, authentic internal messages between senior Russian military commanders. Messages that paint a picture of an institution in crisis, a military stretched beyond capacity, and a leadership increasingly disconnected from battlefield reality. What these generals are really saying will reshape how the world understands this war. And it begins with a single encrypted transmission that was never supposed to leave the walls of the Russian Ministry of Defense. For 18 months now, there had been whispers, not official statements, not formal intelligence briefings, just whispers, that Russia's military command structure was preparing something unprecedented. The Kremlin has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a formula. But what set off alarm bells in Washington, London, and Brussels this month was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators: the routine encrypted traffic between regional commands, the standard logistical coordination between supply depots, the predictable movement of senior officers between headquarters, the sudden cessation of all of the above. All of that went quiet, and whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Intelligence officials from 3 NATO member states confirmed to our sources that beginning approximately 3 weeks ago, Russian military communication patterns shifted dramatically. The constant background noise of military bureaucracy, the requisition orders, the personnel movements, the equipment transfers, all of it dropped to levels not seen since the weeks before the initial invasion. Something was being planned, something was being coordinated, and whatever it was, Moscow was taking extraordinary precautions to keep it hidden. But here's what the Kremlin didn't anticipate: their own people would become the breach. Early Tuesday morning, intelligence services operating in Eastern Europe detected what they described as an anomalous data transmission from within the Russian Western Military District, including communication fragments that had not been intercepted in over 14 months. These are the kinds of internal messages that the Kremlin only generates when they are signaling something very specific: a major offensive, a strategic withdrawal, or a fundamental reassessment of war objectives. Western analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Russia's military leadership was changing posture. And when a nuclear-armed state shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency on Earth pays attention. The intercepted communications, totaling approximately 47 separate message fragments over a 72-hour period, originated from what sources describe as a compromised node within Russia's secure military network. How that node was compromised remains classified, but what came through that node is now reshaping Western understanding of the war. The messages include direct communications between at least 4 senior Russian generals, including one believed to be within the inner circle of Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. They discuss casualty figures that differ dramatically from official Russian statements. They debate equipment shortages that Moscow has publicly denied. They argue, sometimes bitterly, about strategic decisions that have cost thousands of lives. And perhaps most significantly, they reveal a military leadership that is increasingly at odds with political directives from the Kremlin itself. The warning issued by NATO intelligence coordinators this week was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials, after emergency briefings, described Russia's internal communications as fractured, contradictory, and perhaps most importantly, desperate in ways that suggest senior commanders have lost faith in current strategy. But desperation only creates danger if the outside world hesitates. The West did not. In fact, the response over the past 72 hours has been among the most coordinated we've seen since the war began. Here's what we know. Within hours of the initial intercept confirmation, NATO convened an emergency intelligence sharing session involving 14 member states. These weren't the routine quarterly briefings. These were crisis protocols, mechanisms that NATO only activates when they are preparing to reassess fundamental assumptions about an adversary's capabilities and intentions. The implications are staggering. If these intercepts are accurate, and multiple intelligence agencies have now confirmed their authenticity, then the picture of Russian military strength that has dominated Western planning for 18 months may be fundamentally flawed. The generals are saying things internally that directly contradict everything Moscow has stated publicly, and the West is now scrambling to understand what that means. Tonight, sources confirmed that intelligence services have cataloged communications across multiple command levels, including messages from the Southern Military District that had recently been restructured for what analysts believe was the anticipated spring offensive. Western agencies intercepted these communications before Moscow could implement enhanced encryption protocols. They captured messages about personnel shortages. They captured debates about ammunition supplies. They captured frank assessments of equipment losses that were likely being hidden from the Kremlin's political leadership. In other words, the West intercepted the real conversation, the one Russian generals have when they're not performing for cameras or preparing sanitized reports for Vladimir Putin. The truth that would make these communications so dangerous if exposed. This is what made NATO's response so urgent. Russia's internal fractures weren't just concerning, they were actionable intelligence. They represented the kind of insight that could reshape battlefield strategy if properly leveraged. And Western military planners, understanding that fully, responded with coordination, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't leak everything immediately. They didn't broadcast intercepts to embarrass Moscow. They verified authenticity first. They assessed strategic implications second. They coordinated response protocols third. And now they're deciding how much the public needs to know. What we can share tonight represents only a fraction of what intelligence agencies have actually obtained. But even this fraction paints a picture that should concern anyone watching this conflict and perhaps offer hope to those who believed Russian military strength was insurmountable. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's latest military positioning was designed to test the resolve of Western support after months of political debate about aid packages. Moscow wanted to see whether NATO would fragment under domestic political pressure, but instead, the opposite happened. Western intelligence services didn't retreat into silos. They shared information with a speed and comprehensiveness that was so immediate, so thorough, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But this week, Western coordination did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Russia's command restructuring as strategic repositioning, a way to consolidate forces before what many expected would be a major spring offensive. But intercepted communications proved today that Russia's military remains both overstretched and undersupplied. Their internal assessments were not only pessimistic, they were documented so precisely that specific unit readiness levels can now be estimated with high confidence. That specificity matters because it shows Western intelligence has penetrated deeper into Russian military planning than Moscow believed possible. It shows that Russia is not operating from a position of hidden strength. They are operating from a position of managed weakness, and now the West knows it. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of the intelligence breakthrough. Signals intelligence teams operating from NATO facilities in Eastern Europe carried out comprehensive analysis of communication patterns, forcing reassessment of Russian force positioning along the entire front. Cyber operations reportedly accessed message archives that had been stored for internal review within the last 90 days. Human intelligence assets operating inside Russian-controlled territory reportedly confirmed details about command dysfunction referenced in the intercepted communications. This wasn't just a lucky intercept. This wasn't just a single source. This was systematic penetration. This was coordinated intelligence gathering. And coordinated intelligence is the one thing Russia has struggled to counter since Western agencies unified their efforts following the invasion. For every communication security measure Moscow has implemented, Western intelligence has countered with something that maintains access. The technological competition between Russian encryption and Western decryption has been ongoing since the war began. But this week, the West appears to have won a decisive round. Remember, the Kremlin thought Western unity would collapse under energy pressure during the winter of 2022. They thought European populations would demand an end to sanctions as heating costs soared. They thought American political transitions would fragment support for Ukraine. They thought time was on their side. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Western intelligence cooperation has deepened rather than fractured. Support packages have continued despite political debates. And Russian military secrets are now being read by analysts in Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin, sometimes before they're read by the intended recipients in Moscow. The Kremlin's greatest fear was never Ukrainian military capability. It was Western technological superiority applied to intelligence gathering, and that fear is now being realized. What makes this moment so consequential and so dangerous is that Russia's internal communications crisis happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Military hardliners want aggressive escalation. Pragmatic generals want strategic consolidation. Economic advisors want conflict de-escalation. Nationalist commentators want visible victories. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a war that has lasted far longer and cost far more than initial projections suggested. And when leaders in that position discover their internal communications have been compromised, they don't respond with calm assessment. They respond with paranoia, they respond with purges, they respond with desperate moves designed to demonstrate strength. The intercepted messages reveal a command structure already under strain. The exposure of those messages will only increase that strain, and strained leadership makes dangerous decisions. This is why Western intelligence agencies are watching Moscow so carefully right now. Not because they fear Russian strength, but because they fear Russian desperation. NATO's coordinated intelligence assessment, now being distributed to member state governments, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow Moscow to control the information narrative. Officials said plainly that Russia's internal communications were inconsistent with their public statements about military readiness. That is diplomatic language for, they've been lying, and now we can prove it. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO intelligence coordinators unless something serious is at stake. The decision to confirm the intercept's existence, even while protecting specific content, represents a calculated choice. Western agencies are telling Moscow, we're inside your communications. We know what your generals really think. We know the gap between your propaganda and your reality, and we're prepared to use that knowledge. The psychological impact of that message may ultimately prove more significant than any specific intelligence gained from the intercepts themselves. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed European leaders in a measured, determined speech tonight. He said, "Our partners now understand what we have always known, that Russian military strength is a performance, and behind the curtain is chaos." He said, "The intercepted truths confirm what Ukrainian soldiers see every day, an enemy that is struggling, an enemy that is divided, an enemy that can be defeated." And he said, "We do not ask for sympathy based on these revelations. We ask for continued support based on the strategic opportunity they represent. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become." Zelensky is making the case that the intercepted communications don't just embarrass Moscow, they create a window of strategic opportunity that must be exploited before Russia adapts. The question now is whether Western nations will respond to that opportunity with action or hesitation. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's communications security breach wasn't isolated. Along with the intercepted military messages, Russian state media networks also experienced what appears to be coordinated cyber interference this week. Financial communication systems between Russian military contractors showed unusual vulnerability patterns. Russian diplomatic traffic between embassies in 3 European capitals increased dramatically, suggesting crisis management protocols. All of this happened within the same 72-hour period. When multiple Russian systems show vulnerability simultaneously, it means something larger is underway. Either Western intelligence has achieved a breakthrough of unprecedented scale, or Russia's internal security apparatus is failing across multiple domains. Neither possibility is reassuring for Moscow, and both possibilities suggest that the information advantage, so critical in modern conflict, has shifted decisively toward the West. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a significant military action designed to change battlefield momentum before Western nations can fully exploit the intelligence breakthrough. Another is that Moscow is attempting to identify and eliminate the source of the communications breach, potentially triggering internal purges that will further destabilize military command. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to accelerate unconventional options, including increased nuclear rhetoric, as a way to change the strategic conversation away from their conventional military weaknesses. But today, Western intelligence coordination took that card off the table. They didn't remain silent about the intercepts. They didn't allow Moscow to control the narrative. They didn't wait for Russian information operations to spin the story. They confirmed authenticity, assessed implications, and began shaping international understanding of what the intercepts mean. What we're watching now is a test of institutional resilience. Russia wants to see whether their command structure can absorb this exposure and maintain operational security going forward. Ukraine wants to show that Western intelligence support translates into battlefield advantage. NATO wants to prevent any Russian escalation driven by desperation or miscalculation, and the international community wants to prevent this conflict from expanding beyond its current boundaries. Every actor is watching, every actor is calculating, every actor is preparing for multiple scenarios. The intercepted communications didn't just reveal Russian military secrets, they triggered a cascade of strategic reassessment that will shape this conflict for months to come. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials who are now monitoring Russian command networks for signs of response to the exposure. They say there has been a significant increase in encrypted traffic between Moscow and field commanders, likely damage assessment. They say personnel movements suggest at least 2 senior officers may have been recalled to the capital for what are being described as consultations. And they say Russia's decision to restructure communication protocols is likely part of broader damage control intended to limit further intelligence losses. But the West is not retreating from this advantage. In fact, Western intelligence services are doubling down on collection efforts. Their response this week, coordinated, transparent, and strategically timed, sent a message to Moscow that penetration is deep and ongoing. And it sent a message to Ukraine that Western technological support extends far beyond visible military equipment. As the coming weeks unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia's generals hope to achieve with their disputed strategies. But what we do know is that Western intelligence coordination was timely. It revealed fractures that Moscow wanted hidden. It confirmed weaknesses that propaganda had denied. And it created strategic opportunities that may reshape the conflict. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the next 30 days. If they consolidate and adapt, this moment will be remembered as a temporary setback. If they fracture further under the pressure of exposure, Western intelligence services have already shown they are positioned to exploit every crack. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown they are watching. And tonight, for the first time in 18 months, the Kremlin appears to be genuinely uncertain. Moscow is quiet. Too quiet. And when Moscow is quiet, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russian military leadership learned something they have learned many times, but somehow keep forgetting. Secrets have a way of escaping even the most secure channels. Lies told to political leadership eventually collide with battlefield reality. And Western intelligence capabilities should never be underestimated. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The gap between Russian propaganda and Russian reality has been documented. The fractures within Russian military command have been confirmed, and the West now possesses insight into Kremlin decision-making that will shape every strategic calculation going forward. The generals are saying what they really think, and now the world is listening. We will be here analyzing every detail as the next phase of this conflict unfolds.